Good morning. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. I am in Romans chapter 8, verse 1. Last week we ended in chapter 7, where Paul made this statement, many of us are with which many are familiar. Verse 24, "What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this dying body or body of death?" And then he recognized God's grace with regard to his mind, despite the fact that with his flesh he serves the sin nature. And this then leads him to this absolutely important conclusion. It's going to lead him into the next section, but it's so important for believers to get this. And I find that many of us don't. And even if we know this, we still struggle to just believe what God says. Therefore, no condemnation exists for those in Christ Jesus. See that? No condemnation exists for those who are in Christ Jesus. Now, I do want to pull up the King James Version because the King James Version follows the Textus Receptus, which is somewhat included in a version of the text called the majority text. They're not in agreement a lot of the time, but this is one place where they are. And it says, "Therefore, there is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus." Then they add, "who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit." Now, these last words were moved up from verse 4 that says that the righteousness of law might be fulfilled in us who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. And these last words were moved up here, intentionally or unintentionally. That's something we don't know, to the end of verse 1. But I would just say this in defense of the Nestle text, that is the Greek text that stands behind the HCSB. And I personally oftentimes like a lot of things that we have in the majority text. But I would say this. Some of the older Greek manuscripts, in my opinion, not everybody would agree with, sometimes reflected a little bit more of a legalistic perspective on Christianity. There's a statement on John 8 where we have in the oldest Greek manuscripts, we have the first verses of Romans 8 omitted because the woman in adultery did not fit the thinking of somebody or somebodies that were copying texts. And we actually have a man by the name of Augustine very early on in the church's history. And whether you like Augustine or not, he does make this comment that people had removed those words from the text, and they did so for fear that it would encourage their wives to be unfaithful. So people were intentionally removing words from the text. Not everybody accepts that Augustine's words are legitimate, but nonetheless, I do think that's interesting that then those older manuscripts omit here these last words, "who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit." And when they do show that tendency to be legalistic, I would think that it would be more likely that they would leave these last words in than that they would remove them. Because removing them, again, tends towards license in the minds of some people. Therefore, now back to the more important point. Just have to deal with that because I have people, when I come bring this up, they're going, "Oh, you can't stop there. The King James has this." Anyway, Romans 8:1. "Therefore, no condemnation now exists for those in Christ Jesus." And he's talking about those of us that are in Christ. Now, when you were put into Christ, when I was put into Christ, we saw back in Romans 6, we were put into his death so that there was a death to the sin nature. And the sin nature is what brought condemnation. Now, Paul uses the same word condemnation 2 other times in the New Testament, and he uses this noun over in chapter 5. He uses it once in verse 16, The HCSB has, and the gift is not like the one man's sin or the one sinning, because from one came judgment resulting in condemnation, but from many trespasses is the gift resulting in justification. So he's looking back here in time, and he realizes it was through the one sinning that this condemnation resulting in condemnation. And so he's looking back at what happened with Adam, and he does tie it to trespass, because again, if we go down to verse 18, so then, as through one trespass, and remember we've talked about this in the past, very early on in these studies here in Romans, that this trespass had to do with Adam choosing to not obey God. It's before he even has acted, before he's actually even done the act of sin, he chooses to obey God. And in choosing to obey God in this way, he bends his nature. I believe part of it is he's choosing Eve, because Eve was the only one, and God made Eve for Adam, brought her to him, and Adam then in his mind, now this is my guess on this, so be very cautious with what you might repeat. But that Adam sees Eve and he reasons in his mind, well, this must be the right choice, because didn't God bring her to me, even though I know God specifically told me not to eat from the tree. And there's a trespass, because he's choosing to do something that God has not said. And in that, he twists, he bends his nature. And that's where this sin nature came from. And this resulted then in condemnation. Condemnation over here in Romans 5. And this, I think, is really important for us to get. And we saw this early on. It is not tied alone to Adam's act of sin, which is what most of us in Christianity, we kind of reduce it to the sin. But in reality, that condemnation is tied to the trespass, the offense, that decision that bent his nature and resulted in a sin nature, which is the big problem that Paul's dealing with here in Romans 5 through 8. So if we understand this condemnation, then we understand that because you and I have been put into Christ, where the sin nature has been dealt with, where Christ died to the sin nature, then we can realize, well, if the penalty has been paid by Christ, he actually paid the penalty for that trespass, and he dealt with the sin nature itself. Even though I have a sin nature, there's no condemnation if I'm in Christ. Now down here, to be honest, Hebrews 12 would indicate, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, I think maybe around verse 30 or so, or 32, God does enter into judgment or discipline with his own, with believers. But that's different than condemnation. Condemnation is more of a judicial matter, and it has more to do with what happens with regard to a person's eternal destiny. And so Paul is bringing out here, no condemnation exists. There isn't any condemnation if you're in Christ Jesus. That's something that'll encourage you. And it starts to set you in the right direction about thinking about your sin nature problem, your sin issue, and helping you begin to have the right motivation for having victory. That it's now not so much about trying to avoid being bad. It's more that you've been freed and you want to live as a freed one in Christ. And that'll encourage you, just as it has encouraged me, to have a good day in the Lord. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget down below to click the like and the subscribe, and perhaps even the share button, and sharing this with others if you think that this would be helpful to them. Thank you again for joining me today.